Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California and this evening's meeting. I'm Eric Siegel, Chair of the Club's Personal Growth Forum and your host. We invite everyone to visit us online at commonwealthclub.org for a complete listing of all our events and to register for any of our events. This evening, we continue our series of talks about false narratives and their cousins, conspiracy theories, which can damage the shared fact base on which democracy depends. Whether through distorted context, misleading editing, oversimplification, incorrect extrapolation from a few examples, or just outright lying, the result is the same. Phone rings. Aggravation of the entire society. This case, it says it's a telemarketer. Loss of trust in institutions like the phone company, tribalism and a search for an authoritarian leader in confusing times, increased stress levels and anger in society, and resulting legitimization of violence. It's therefore important that we look at the causes of false narratives and some possible actions we can take to decrease their power. Our first talk in the series on September 1st by Joe Pierre was a tutorial on the psychology of false narratives and the social and technological factors that make them so powerful today. Then on September 6th, Lee McIntyre discussed how to talk with a friend or a family member who's fallen into the trap of a conspiracy theory such as science denial. And the third talk, by Sam Woolley on September 29th, was about actions we can take as a society and as individuals to reduce the power of false narratives in our world. You can find these for free on the club website. Just look for commonwealthclub.org and the Watch and Listen tab and search for false or denier, and they'll pop right up. This talk by Michael Shermer, author of the new book, Conspiracy. Let's wave the book around.
Oh.
Yay. And founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine. Yay.
Available at fine bookstores everywhere and at skeptic.com.
Yeah. Continues the series by presenting an overarching review and summary of conspiracy theories, who believes them and why, which ones are real, and what we can do about them. Dr. Shermer received a BA in psychology and an MA in experimental psychology, along with a PhD in the history of science. He wrote over 200 monthly columns for Scientific American, 20 best-selling books, and created 2 TED Talks that have been seen by millions and were voted in the top 100. Dr. Shermer's been a college professor since 1979 and is currently a presidential fellow at Chapman University, where he teaches a course in critical thinking called Skepticism 101. How to think like a scientist. So I know he's not just eager to hear and discuss our questions about conspiracy theories, he has the background to help us understand what is going on. So let's get started.
Okay.
In your book, you discuss 3 major topics. Why people believe these conspiracy theories, how to figure out which ones are real, because sometimes conspiracy theories are factual, and talking to conspiracists and how to rebuild trust in truth. We only have about 40 minutes and then we'll get to questions, so we're going to have to step right along, touch the main points. But again, if you want the detailed discussions, buy the book, right? Anyway, so let's start with, why do people believe in these things? I mean, I know I'm trained as an engineer, and so even I find that I actually make a lot of decisions emotionally, and then I very quickly retrofit some sort of logical argument so I can pretend it was logical. And if I'm doing this, and I suppose scientists and lawyers and others trained in logic are doing this, I can only imagine what everyone else is doing. So why are we doing this psychologically? I mean, where do we start? Maybe we should start by talking about what is a conspiracy theory, but then, how is this happening psychologically?
Mm-hmm. Well, so your own personal observation, that's called motivated reasoning. That is, we're motivated to be correct, be right, rather than find truth. Our brains are more like lawyers than scientists to win the argument. I mean, this is the thesis of a book on the kind of evolutionary origins of reason, Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber's book, and they argued that we evolved to win arguments more than find truth, which is difficult to find. And so the motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, where you look for and find confirming evidence for what you already believe, and you ignore the disconfirming evidence or spin doctor it away or whatever, to the point where cognitive dissonance kicks in, where you hold one set of beliefs and the evidence contradicts it. Something's got to go. That produces dissonance. Leon Fessinger's famous theory. Mostly what happens is the contradictory evidence gets spin doctored away. The belief remains stable. So he discovered this with the UFO cult on December 21st, 1954, when he went to the top of the mountain with the local group that thought the mothership was coming that night to rescue them before the world came to an end the next day. So he thought, well, that'll be interesting. See what happens, assuming the world doesn't end. What will they do? Like tomorrow? Will they go back and go, oh, that was the dumbest thing I've ever done. Can I have my car back and my job or whatever? And no, in fact, they went back and doubled down and tried to recruit people into the group to kind of reinforce that they really are right. And then, well, what about that uncomfortable fact that the world didn't end? Oh, well, we miscalculated, forgot to carry the one. It's tomorrow night, or it's next year, and they always do that. Or it was a test of our faith, and God spared us, or whatever. So that's what happens. We know from extensive studies in cognitive psychology that people do not naturally try to falsify their hypotheses. So a psychologist named Peter Wasson developed a series of little tests of this. So if I gave you a series of numbers and said, what do you think is the rule? Here's the numbers: 2, 4, 6. All right? What's the rule?
Even numbers.
Okay. Here's another set: 10, 12, 14.
Same thing.
Okay. So you think the rule is increasing numbers by 2?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody want to test the hypothesis? Give me another series of 3 numbers.
1, 3, 5.
That also matches the rule. Oh, so it's not just
It's not
even
just even
numbers.
numbers.
Okay. How about another one?
Just a series of ascending numbers.
That's it. All right. So, but almost nobody comes up with that. You see how long it took even
Series of ascending numbers is
Yeah.
what he said, yeah.
a super smart group like this. It took a little while to get to let's try something different. So that doesn't come naturally. The moment you form a hypothesis in your head about anything.
Right, yeah, you start reinforcing it.
Right.
You don't want to hear that
Right,
it might be
right,
wrong.
Right. So that's the core of the problem with all conspiracy theories is the moment you have one, you pick one off the headlines of Kanye West, the Jews are doing this. Okay, well, if you just look around, you can find evidence, oh, look, here's a Jewish guy running this media company. Or here's a Jewish guy running this Wall Street trading house or whatever. It's like, aha. Yeah, okay, well, how many media companies are not run by Jews? What are the counterfactuals? And it's hard to think of it because we don't naturally do that. So conspiracy is 2 or more people plotting in secret to gain an illegal or immoral advantage over somebody else or some other group. And a conspiracy theory is just a theory about that, whether it's true or not. And so the problem we have here is that there are conspiracies. There really are, lots of them, and so it's a signal detection problem. How do you know, right? So just picture a 2x2 grid. So we have 4 cells. So up here you have conspiracy theories that are true, and you say, yes, I think that's true. Okay, that's a hit. And over here you have conspiracy theories that are true, and you say, no, I don't think it's a true conspiracy theory. So that's a miss. And here you have conspiracy theories that are false, and you think they're true, so that's a type 1 error. You've made a false positive. You thought the conspiracy theory was true, and it's not. And then you have the 4th one where you miss it. And so, wait, did I get that right? Or wait, I've confused myself. I've done this diagram multiple ways, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
So you make there's two kinds of errors. Type 1 false positive, you thought the conspiracy theory was real when it's not, or you miss a real conspiracy theory. So my evolutionary argument is that we would err on the side of making more type 1 errors than type 2 errors, assume the worst, just in case. It's a low-cost error to make if it turns out it's not true, like the rustle in the grass. Is it a dangerous predator? Is it just the wind? It doesn't cost a lot to assume the rustle in the grass is a dangerous predator and it turns out it's just the wind. You just become a little skittish and be careful. But if you think it's the wind and it's a dangerous predator, you're
Tiger, right?
your lunch.
Right.
You get a Darwin Award for taking yourself out of the gene pool early. So we're the descendants of making this kind of my more global argument for superstition and magical thinking is that we make more type 1 than type 2 errors, and conspiracy theories are in that same category because we evolved as a social primate species in which other members of our group often plot against us and other groups plot against our group. And so just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, because sometimes they are, right? And so it's reasonable to assume more are true than actually are.
Yeah, the negativity bias. It's always safer to pretend that the tiger is sneaking around than that rustle was, it's the breeze, life is good. It doesn't, it's not a formula for having a happy life, but it's a formula for being here.
Survival, really.
Survival.
Yeah.
And that way your genes can reproduce, and that's...
Right. So we're the descendants of those that made more type 1 errors than type 2 errors. So that's my argument. Right. So I call that constructive conspiracism.
Yeah.
That is, there's a kind of logic to it, a kind of constructive paranoia. A little paranoia is actually okay about everything, because it really comes down to the second law of thermodynamics and entropy. There's just far more ways for things to go wrong than to go better, right? How many ways can your life get better? Well, a little bit here, a little bit there. But you could walk out and get hit by one of those electric trolley things here you have in San Francisco, or whatever. There's just lots of ways for things to go south fast. So it's good to actually be a little cautious about dangers.
So this is one of the factors that are forcing people into then a little bit of exaggeration. You're a little bit stressed, and it's not just negativity bias. It's also, I'm stressed. Now I'm really going to worry about stuff, the slightest noise, the slightest... so that kind of
course, you don't want to be
loss of control.
You don't want to be too far down the spectrum there, because then you can't even leave the house. So at some point, if it's like that, you end up with like an OCD kind of thing, where you're not functional. So obviously that's not good, right? So there's some balance there.
And as you said, there's a history of things that really are true. There people were plotting and governments were plotting and whatever. And you had a term for that, proxy conspiracy.
Yeah. So I mean, my type specimen examples: Volkswagen cheating the emission standards in Europe. That's a conspiracy.
Yep.
And it really happened, and it's obvious why they did it. It's no big secret. They're not trying to take over the world. They just want to make more money, right? So, I mean, those kind of small, more targeted, narrowly focused theories are more likely to be true, because we know that's what people do, corporations do, government agencies do, and so on. So one of my signal detection criteria is the more people that have to be involved, the more elements that have to come together, and the more grandiose the conspiracy theory, the less likely it is to be true. More narrowly focused, insider trading or some government agency that's spying on its own citizens. This happens a lot. Just to review, as we may remember, without Edward Snowden and the WikiLeaks, we wouldn't have known to what extent the NSA was spying on U.S. citizens without a warrant from a court. Warrantless wiretapping, warrantless surveillance was quite common, and we didn't know that until he leaked that, right? So the Pentagon Papers, to what extent was the U.S. government lying about the Vietnam War? Quite a bit, right? So whistleblowers are important to find out what's really going on. But there, there's kind of a logic to it. Again, not trying to take over the world or whatever, just, lying about because we want to do this, we want to do that. Very specific, narrowly focused ones. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it'll come up a bit later when we talk about talking to individuals. But one of the nice things about even remembering that there really are conspiracy theories is that when you're talking to somebody who has fallen into one that is false, having some feeling of respect, and not just saying, hey, you're an idiot. That usually doesn't work real well. but thinking in the back of your head, maybe he is right. And that puts him and you into a more receptive mode. You're going to ask him questions, why, and this kind of thing. Well, we can come back to some of that stuff, because at the beginning, again, it's like, why are we getting into these conspiracy theories? I mean, what is it also about the technology today that amplifies this? I mean, people have a right to be heard, but they don't have a right to be amplified, as has been said. It used to be you could stand on the street corner and convince 10 people. Now, boom, it's everywhere.
Right.
And I think part of that may be that this idea that how do you decide something is true? We had one of our earlier speakers talk about that. It's repetition. So with the web, you can suddenly, and AM radio and whatever, you can get repetition from a million areas. And that seems to build the conspiracy theories nowadays.
Not just by itself, though. If it tags something in your tribe, so I call this tribal conspiracy, but it's something that your tribe is likely to believe and supports your central tenets of your beliefs, you don't need a lot of evidence, just anything. It could be one word. Rigged. Everybody knows what this means, right? Yeah, rigged.
It's rigged.
Right. We call this the new conspiracism, the conspiracy theory without the theory. I mean, even the flat earthers have arguments. Believe me, I've heard them.
Hey, I want to put in my classic joke, how we know that the world isn't flat. Because if it were, all the cats would have pushed everything off by now. All right, back. I just had to stick that in.
Yeah, so I mean, so I have this kind of three-part theory of conspiracism, right? So we talked about constructive conspiracism. A lot of them are true, so it pays to type 1, type 2 errors. And then tribal conspiracism, like, rigged elections or whatever. Does anybody really believe this? Well, I think the rank and file probably does, according to surveys. It looks like no one in the top of the GOP in 2020 believed it. Once Attorney General Barr said, we looked into it. Mm-hmm. I'm a Republican, lifelong Republican, Trump supporter, couldn't find any evidence. 60 Minutes on Sunday had the guy in Arizona who was lifelong Republican, voted for Trump twice, and Giuliani called him and said, you got to do something here. You got to stop this, because Biden won the electorate votes there in Arizona. You got to stop it. He goes, well, do you have evidence that there was fraud? Oh, yeah. So Giuliani flies in there and then meets with this guy, Rusty Baker. And the guy goes, okay, show me. Do we have that? Giuliani says to his assistant, well, I think we left it at the hotel. Okay. So why do people continue to believe it? Well, because we're Republicans. This is our tribe. We got to win. Sacrificing the truth for your tribe. That happens a lot. And proxy conspiracism, my third one, is whether the specific conspiracy theory is true or false is less important than what it stands for. It's a proxy for something else. So if you think about Pizzagate, which has to be the dumbest conspiracy theory I've ever heard, that Hillary and the other Democrats and throw in Beyonce and Tom Hanks, I guess, were running a secret satanic pedophile ring out of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. I mean, does anybody really believe that? Well, one guy did, Edgar Welch. He went there with his AR-15 rifle to break it up. He drove 3.5 hours from his house and made a video, driving along with his cell phone, and explained, I'm going in. No one's doing anything about it. There's a crime being committed. A horrible, horrible crime, and I'm going to do something. No one's doing anything about it. I'm going to do something about it. Which, in a way, is kind of what you would do. If something was really horrible happening, it's like, the police aren't doing anything. I'm going to do something. Right? So he went in there, and there's no basement. And he's like, uh-oh. and that was the end of that. He ended up in jail for a couple of years. But most people, I think, if you took him to the basement and you took him to the pizzeria and go, look, there's no basement, there's nothing here. There's some, people eating pizza there's a kids party, but that's not exactly a pedophile ring. It's not like these people are going to go, oh, in that case, I'll vote for Hillary. They were never going to vote for Hillary. So it's a proxy, along the lines of that. Okay, this one's not true, but it's the kind of thing those Democrats would do. They're conniving and they want to ruin America. They would take away our freedoms and our guns and blah. And wasn't there something in the 90s about the Clinton body count with that guy Vince Foster and that real estate thing that went bad? And wasn't there something about Bill Clinton on the plane with Jeffrey Epstein to that island where there was a pedophile ring, right? Well, not exactly, but Epstein's preferences appeared to be girls 14 to 17 or so, not 5-year-olds. But you just sort of conflate all those into a theory, and then had the pizza thing. Well, cheese pizza CP is child pornography.
Boy!
And it just goes on and on and on. And before, 2 years later, you get down the rabbit hole, and you have this crazy idea, such that even if you debunk it, somebody holding that, so they don't believe it in the kind of traditional sense I believe in gravity or whatever. They believe it in some other kind of proxy sense. It stands for something else.
That's why it's so tough to talk someone out of it, because this is part of their identity. It's part of their, as you said, their tribe kind of believes this, and they're searching around for stories that get reinforced in their tribe. And if you debunk one, you're kind of challenging who they are, and their tribe is going to throw them out, and then they're going to be, lonely on the outside, which is kind of why they got involved with this tribe in the first place. So
I do think if
trouble.
Enough Republicans speak out against the rigged election conspiracy theory and Trump, we haven't hit the tipping point yet. Maybe after the midterms,
I think they're beginning to get
a few people will emerge that are probably going to be more supported in the GOP, and then everyone will say, I never really believed the rigged election. I just kind of went along with it, and then, but I don't think we're there yet, but hopefully we'll get there. It's a concern.
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, you've seen it. People act on January 6th. People act on their beliefs. The guy that went to Pelosi's house. Okay, some mental illness too doesn't help, right? So, but it's not just mental illness. He had a conspiracy theory in his head. The election was rigged. Nancy Pelosi is evil. I'm going to go in there and break her kneecaps and then send a signal.
And what does family say? That he was isolated, and he was, COVID with the last few years, people are isolated. They're on the web. They kind of go down the rabbit hole. They find a new community. They get in with the community, and now they're all kind of reinforced, and it gets nuttier and nuttier. We had one comment that had come up earlier, which was, the technology companies aren't necessarily, evil doing this. They're just trying to make money. And one of the ways, for example, that Facebook would keep you on its site is by giving you stuff to look at. So you join a group, as we talked about before, for new mothers. And they see you're a member of that group, and that group overlaps another group that talks about vaccines. They don't know it's new mothers and vaccines. It's just group A and group B to them. But they see the overlap. So they feed you a couple from the vaccine group to see if you'll bite. Are you interested? And if you are, now you get more and more of that stuff because it keeps you on the site so they can show you more ads. Well, now that you're also in the vaccine group, they'll feed you some from another group, maybe a little crazier. Now it's, QAnon or something. And if you bite, okay, great, we'll show you more. And so now you get that repetition, and you're in a new group, and you get reinforcement. But it's not that they're out there to make QAnon look, push that. It's just group A and group B and group C to them, with certain overlaps. Mm-hmm. And so off we go. And that didn't exist, 25 years ago.
Right. So the JFK conspiracy theorists, for example, they used to meet in hotel rooms, conference rooms, and have their little mimeographed newsletters that go out to 100 people or something. That's it. They just didn't have self-published books. They just didn't have the horsepower to reach a lot of people. But now, like Loose Change, that homemade film about 9/11, it was made in 2000. Late 2002, 2003, I had 10 million views in a few weeks. I mean, the kind of numbers that Hollywood producers would kill for their films. And so the penetration is much deeper, and the spread is much quicker. Overnight, you can get these things going and get viral videos, and that's what's new. Conspiracism is not new. It goes all the way back to probably the origins of civilization. You know, when Rome burned, you know, there was kind of different theories about what Nero was up to.
Oh,
you know.
right.
Did he let it happen on purpose, LIHOP, or did he make it happen on purpose, MIHOP? Right. These are the kind of terms from 9/11 truthism. Did Bush, you know it was going to happen and he let it happen as a excuse to invade Iraq, or was he actually in on it, where he ordered people to plant the explosive devices in the World Trade Center building? So LIHOP and MIHOP. Same thing with President Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor. There was investigations into, well, how did this happen? You know, a lot of racism. There's no way the Japanese could have pulled this off. I mean, they can't even see. Look, they squint. I mean, really, seriously. They're too dumb and they can't see. How did they manage to so successfully attack Pearl Harbor?
Oh.
Somebody must have been in on it, Roosevelt or, so on and so forth. So LIHOP and MIHOP, but I introduced CowHop, capitalized on what happened on purpose. Right, so Roosevelt wanted to get in the war. He wanted to support Churchill and the British against the Nazis. Couldn't do it. Couldn't get congressional support. The American Firsters, led by Charles Lindbergh, had quite a strength to block no more American entanglements in European wars. We're not going to do this anymore after the disastrous First World War. And so, but after Pearl Harbor, okay, everybody's like, okay, now we're in. Right. So, and same thing with Bush. We know he wanted to invade Iraq. He didn't have an excuse. Now he has an excuse. He didn't make it happen. He didn't let it happen, but it happened. And now, okay, so we're going to do what we want to do. All politicians do that.
Well, that brings us to the second part, which is like, how do we differentiate between a conspiracy theory that's fake and a conspiracy theory that they really are out to get us?
Yeah. Right. Well, so again, to just kind of hit some of those, the more people that have to be involved, the more elements that have to come together just right for it to happen, the bigger and grander the scope of the theory, less likely it is to be true. And so I just take 9/11 as an inside job, as a type specimen that we all saw the planes hit, although I should note parenthetically, there are conspiracy theorists that are say there were no planes. They're called the no-planers. And they're debunked by the truthers who think, of course there were planes, but there were also bombs. And they, those people that say there were no planes, they're idiots. It's kind of amusing to see them debunk each other. It's like when I used to, in the 90s, I did a debate with young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists, and they kind of went after each other. It was kind of funny.
Boy.
But just to think, how could it possibly have happened? You'd have to know ahead of time which floors the planes were going to hit on the World Trade Center buildings. I mean, the hijackers were instructed, tilt the plane so you hit more floors and you do more damage this way rather than straight on. And they did that, right? So somehow the guys in there that were planting the explosive devices would have had to know it's going to be floors 96 through 107. And so that's where you plant the explosive devices. Impossible. Not to mention, Al-Qaeda tried to blow up the World Trade Center building in 93. So these were the most heavily secured buildings in the country. Somehow they got in there and broke through, you got to break through the drywall to get to the beams, and no one noticed. Oh, well, they did it under the pretense of elevator repair. Elevator repair? Because you're not near the elevators when they're planning to, Anyway, it's just crazy. And somehow all this got pulled off, and not one person has come forward to say, I was dating this guy and he told me all about it, or somebody that wants to write a tell-all book on 60 Minutes, or back to WikiLeaks, right? Millions of classified documents, not one related to 9/11 as an inside job, not one memo, nothing. Impossible. This is how we find out about things. Like, let me just rattle off a few of the ones in the context of constructive conspiracism. Operation COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program conducted by the FBI to plant agents in social justice movement groups in America. The American Indian movement, several feminist groups, the Black Panthers, dozens of groups, civil rights groups, in which, in some of apparently meetings like this, half the people there were FBI spies. And one of the activists said he could tell because they always had wingtips on. They had kind of like tie-dye shirts, but wingtips. Like, come on, dude, you're wearing the wrong shoes. Anyway, all the way up to blackmailing Martin Luther King Jr., about the famous letter that was sent to him saying, they taped he wasn't the most faithful husband, let's just put it that way. And so he had trysts in hotel rooms, and they taped him having sex and said, we're going to release the tapes sort of like revenge porn, which is illegal. We're going to release the tapes unless you kill yourself. Basically, and the letter, turns out it came from the FBI. Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover orchestrated it. What? Our government did this? Yeah. Okay. That's just one, right? Project MK Ultra, in which the CIA was worried about the gap. We were worried about the missile gap with the Russians. Well, we're worried about the brainwashing gap. Those Russians and Chinese and North Koreans are ahead of us on brainwashing. Manchurian Candidate, you know, we're going to program this guy to go assassinate somebody. And so we got to get in on this. So they dosed U.S. citizens without their knowledge, without their consent, with LSD and other mind-altering drugs. One guy, Frank Olson, who was a chemist who worked for the CIA, on this program, they dosed him without telling him. They just had a dinner or something they put in his drink, and then he kind of lost his mind. 10 days later, he jumped out of a New York high-rise to his death, or he was pushed. And the CIA hasn't admitted anything, but they did a $750,000 payout to the family decades later because his son kept the story alive, Eric Olson. Anyway, you can see all this on Netflix. There's a Earl Morris film called Wormwood, and it's all about this. And this is, our government is doing this illegally, right? There's no congressional approval for this. No one even knows about it. Operation Paperclip, in which we're nabbing Nazi scientists that were working on biological weapons, chemical weapons, and of course nuclear weapons and rockets, the most famous of which, the paper clip goes on the file that we're going to take this guy and move him to America and set him up and give him a job so he'll work for us instead of the Russians, because they're trying to get him too. Or if we don't, then he's going to put him on trial at Nuremberg for war crimes. Whoa, what? Werner von Braun is the most famous example of this. He worked on the Apollo program. But there were hundreds of them like that. And these are guys like the guy, I forget his last name. He invented sarin gas for the Nazis. All right? Now, Hitler didn't use gas as a weapon. Clearly, he had no qualms about it, using it against Jewish populations. But the gas as a weapon was there, invented by the Nazis. So we got to get this guy now. He works for us. Our government did this, right? And this was not approved by Congress or anything like that. And I can just go on and on. All the attempts to assassinate Castro, dozens of attempts including working with the mafia. Because if you're going to have somebody assassinate somebody, you hire somebody that knows what they're doing, right? Competent. They're competent assassins. Let's get those guys. They do it all the time, right? So in 1962, people high up in the Kennedy administration brought to Kennedy and Robert McNamara a document called, it's called, not Wormwood. It's anyway, it'll come to me for a second. But we have the document in which they constructed plans for false flag operations. You've heard this term from Alex Jones. Sandy Hook is a false flag operation. What does that mean? The pirate ship raises a false flag, so the other ship thinks they're okay, and then they attack it, right? So it's a pretense to doing something nasty. And we were already doing this, right? After the failed Bay of Pigs operation, it's like, okay, we got to do something else. And to get rid of this guy, can't have communists 90 miles from Miami, so they tried to kill him and so on. And then so they finally brought to Kennedy and McNamara, okay, how about we shoot down a commercial airliner filled with American students on their way to Cancun or whatever, and we'll blame it on the Cubans, and then we'll invade. And there was like 24 suggestions like this, all outlined. Now, to their credit, Kennedy and McNamara said, we're not going to kill American citizens. That's crazy. We'll do something else to try to get rid of Castro, right? And but that's happened a lot. All the attempted manipulation of elections in South American countries to favor fascist dictators over communist dictators because they're a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. He's more favorable to American business interests. That's gone on a lot. So when somebody says, I think the government's up to no good, they have good reason.
And yet, how do we differentiate? I mean, one of the things that we can do is we can say that in many cases, we can look at the engineering or the science of it, or some external proof to figure out whether it's happened or not. So in election conspiracy theories or a lot of scientific conspiracy theories, we're not depending on, do we believe this guy or that guy? We can say, well, wait a moment. here are the checks and balances, and they're proven, and these people have seen it, and you can audit it yourself, and et cetera, because otherwise it becomes just, do I believe the government's out to get me, as a base belief versus some other kind of belief. I mean, we have to have some way of differentiating. In the 9/11 things you bring up, I mean, we know that exactly how it happened from an engineering point of view. It's not particularly difficult to figure out that, steel at a certain temperature sags. It doesn't melt to a much higher temperature, but it loses its strength at a relatively low temperature. That's why all the steel in buildings is coated with asbestos. It was after the collapse of a building in the 1800s. It was built out of steel. There was a fire, and it softens, and the whole thing kind of falls down. That's why it's all coated with asbestos. It's so that it gives you time to get out of the building before the steel melts. And in 9/11, it loses a little strength, and it kind of sagged in the middle, and it came off the edge supports. When the plane hit the thing, it knocked the asbestos off of the steel. And then, of course, once they start pancaking down, it's like wham, straight down.
Yeah.
So that you can appeal to the engineers, yay engineers, to see what actually happened. Or you could, in the voting cases, you can start saying, well, wait a moment, how is this audited? Who is there? Because otherwise, it's tough to kind of tease these things out. What's real and what's
we have to have kind of trust in the institutions that would know. Because what do I know about why buildings fall? I mean, I remember when these conspiracy theories first started coming out. Well, there's no way a building can fall straight down into its footprint. It's like, why not? I mean, I don't know why buildings fall. Do you? It's like on Twitter, everybody's an expert on Ukraine, and then next week they're an expert on viruses.
Right. The same guys have become
same guys. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So. So you have to think, well, what would be the motivation? So in the case of the World Trade Center buildings, they were insured, and an insurance company has to pay out, billions of dollars for those buildings. So they would be very interested to know if somebody actually planted explosive devices.
Right.
They'd be highly motivated to find out, the President of the United States ordered this thing. In that case, we don't have to pay.
Hey,
yeah.
right.
So of course they would be motivated. So when they go, you know what, we looked into it and this is why it fell, and we have to pay out. And they did. Okay, end of story, right? So again, Attorney General Bill Barr motivated to find fraud if there was, says there wasn't. End of story.
If anyone was motivated to find a problem, he was.
So why, how would I know who to call in Arizona to find out if?
Yeah, it becomes who.
Yeah, so I have to trust that the people that are running the thing, and there's 50 states. Most of us are just regular citizens. We can't check these things. So the whole thing is kind of held aloft by the kind of social glue of trusting that the institutions mostly work, right? I mean, so in Arizona, they really looked into it, and they found 12 votes that were fraudulent, 12, and Biden won by 10,000, right? And anyway, so
yeah, extraordinary, statements require extraordinary proof. Just kind of remembering who am I trusting and what do I. Mm-hmm. But that brings us to what do I do if I pretty much believe that the Earth is not flat, and I have a friend who believes that it's flat, that the cats are not involved, and how do I approach this? I mean, I have personally tried the "you are an idiot" approach, and it did not work very well.
No, it doesn't. Yeah. Yeah, so Thanksgiving dinner's coming up, and
oh boy,
somebody sitting there is going to go, QAnon, right? So that it doesn't work. I worked with Netflix on a series on brainwashing, and we found this on the episode on QAnon. We found a woman in Texas who is highly educated, college degree, married with kids, very successful, running her own PR firm, good-looking woman, and just had the perfect life. And then COVID happens, her business shut down, she's bored out of her skull, kids are off of school, whatever, and she goes down the rabbit hole online. And like 6 months later, the husband, she played the tape for us, his recorded message for, it's me or QAnon. I'm taking the kids and leaving if you don't give this up. And she gave up her family. She came back eventually and like came to her senses.
Wow.
But and she said, well, why? She goes, I told him, this is the most important thing I'll ever do. I am working against this global pedophile ring, the deep state, and I'm part of this. You know, we are going to stop this horrible, this may be the worst thing that's ever happened to our country. And this is my 1776 moment. You know, I'm like Jefferson and Washington.
Purpose in
yeah,
life.
that's one of the motives. You know, so if you try to take that away, that's going to be hard, right? So ask questions. And really, all you can do is listen, be respectful, ask a lot of questions. Oh, that's really interesting. You know, where'd you hear that? You know, what's the source? What's the quality of the source?
Yeah, the more questions, and as we mentioned before, I mean, the respectfulness, the feeling that, well, you know, it might actually be correct.
Yeah, and you can throw in some things like, you know, MK Ultra and some of these other examples of what the CIA has done. You know, yes, it could be,
You know,
but is it actually true? That's what we want to know. Is it actually true? And then you can always ask the counterfactuals. You know, what would it take to change your mind?
That's a great question.
When you ask that, often people go, "Huh, I never thought of that. I don't know." Or they go, nothing. It's like, okay.
Okay, now we're dealing.
I mean,
okay.
we're really at that point.
Let's have dessert.
You're in the,
whatever.
Yeah, pass the cranberry sauce. I mean, there you're like in the realm of religion. You know, if somebody says, well, I'm a Christian, I believe the resurrection of Jesus. Well, what would it take to change your mind? Nothing. I'm a Christian. This is what we believe. End of story, right? And anyway, so
I like the idea of the questions because really the person has to change his or her own mind. You can't, I've discovered, force them to change their mind. And so you start asking, you know, well, what would it take to change your mind? And why, what are the details? You know, well, you know, this is awful. You know, Obamacare is horrible. Well, what is Obamacare? And what,
yes,
what are
most
you,
people have no idea. I mean,
you know, or
the other example was NAFTA. This was, I think it was Hugo Mercier's research on that, you know, asking people that said they're against NAFTA or they're for NAFTA. What is it? It's that what is it? America? I don't know, but it's bad. Because Clinton liked it. That was during the Clinton administration. You know, they don't really know. You know, it's just, I don't know what, it's bad because it's the other team.
Yeah, it's what you said earlier. It's symbolic of their their belief underneath.
Right, yeah.
And so
yeah,
just kind of poking at it, and it doesn't happen immediately. But another thing that has been brought up in a previous talk was that a lot of people got into this because they're lonely, or especially the last few years, and so their emotional pressures to break this loneliness, and this is the group they found. And if you convince them that that group is nuts, then they're back in their original problem of being lonely.
Or bored.
Or whatever. So you've at the same time building a support system for them, you know, family, and so they're not being dropped into the middle of the ocean. That kind of.
There's some recent research on the entertainment value of conspiracy theories.
Oh boy,
they're pretty fun.
They are.
They're kind of interesting. You know, I mean, most of daily life is pretty boring. You know, you just get up, go off to work, take the kids to school, whatever.
And it gives you a sense of understanding.
Yeah,
I mean, there are people. I've heard someone say that people would rather the devil be running the world than that nobody's running the world.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Right. There's nobody in charge. What? You know. How come there's inflation? Well, we can ask this economist, that economist. Oh, it's the Illuminati or it's the Jews. Oh, that makes much more sense than what this guy's talking about over here in the Federal Reserve. You know, it's all so. I mean, the world is pretty chaotic. A lot of it is just randomness. You know, just fluctuation. Things go up, things go down, and you know we attribute causes to the ups and the downs, but there's no cause. It's just random fluctuations, right? So, like if the stars in the sky are random, they're randomly distributed, but they look like fish and scorpions and horses and dippers, big and little, and so on. If my favorite story on that is when Steve Jobs released the iPod, then they added the shuffle feature, which was randomly played your songs from your song list, and they got complaints from customers saying it's not random. Certain songs come up more than others. It's like that is randomness. right? So they had to reprogram it to make it feel random when it actually wasn't random. So if you ask subjects research on this, just flip a coin in your head, like 100 times, and people go, I know, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails, heads, heads. And actually, it's like 6 or 7 in a row for each of them comes up a lot. You get these long streaks that feel non-random, but that actually is randomness. Throw a handful of pennies up on in the air and they land on the ground, they're not going to be evenly distributed. If they were perfectly evenly distributed, there'd be something weird, like there's a magnet under the floor or something. So cancer clusters that epidemiologists try to figure out, they're not randomly distributed in the way we think of it, but the cluster, that is the randomness. So you have to know. So immediately there's a theory, conspiracy, this industrial company was down, up the river, and it's the air or the water that's contaminated by the chemical. Erin Brockovich and all that stuff with her activism. Maybe, but maybe not. It may just be random.
Statistics is tough. I mean, I sweated through that class in college. And so that's one of the areas where you have to trust an expert who says, well,
Right,
we've got N number of people and this is what happens. And because a lot of it is really, it's a little spooky, but people who know it, you use statistics when you don't actually know exactly what's going on. And so you have to start trusting in expertise. I do want to get to questions.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And
you are.
I'm going to tell people at home to remember to write things in the YouTube chat. We already have some. But I'm going to start off with one that was sent to me a little while ago. When dealing with people who are deep into the big lie, is it possible to use a truthful conspiracy theory to counteract a false one? What if an extremist believer was told the truth, that certain information sources were lying to them day after day to manipulate them and their friends? To them, this accurate information would sound outrageous, like a conspiracy theory. So would some of them then flip and follow this new conspiracy theory?
Yeah, interesting. I tried that after the January 6th insurrection. The initial response in the Fox News Trumpistan was, those were Antifa people dressed up like Trumpsters. So then I responded, well, all those BLM movement protests, those are actually Republicans dressed up as Antifa. Right. Proud Boys dressed up. It's like you cross-dressing. It's like, the moment you say that is not testable. Is you're just an assertion. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Sometimes I invoke what I call Hitchens' dictum, that which can be, from Christopher Hitchens, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Do you have any evidence? No. Okay. Then end of conversation. Right? I don't know.
So we have questions out here. We're going to need a mic runner. Whoops.
Well,
I'm going to end up being a mic runner.
We can just repeat the mic.
Okay, well, we can repeat questions.
Or here's a mic. He's got a mic.
Yeah, I can go run the mic. Whatever. So we go to I'll do it. That way you can.
Yeah, you're an engineer.
You can run this. Well, I'm going to ask one from that came in from YouTube. Do you think Trump actually believes the 2020 election was stolen?
I don't know. It's hard to say. We can't get the problem of other minds. We can't get in other people's heads.
We need you to tell us.
It's possible. I mean, did Jim Jones really believe his nonsense? Do cult leaders believe it? Do psychics, astrologers really believe it? Maybe, because if enough of their followers reinforce it, maybe they come to believe it. There's a theory, Bob Triver's theory about deception and self-deception, that if you're lying, it's a heavier cognitive load because you got to keep track of the truth and then the lie you told, and then you forgot, and so you told the second lie, whatever. So it takes more cognition. But if you believe the lie, it's just only one thing to remember. So you're less likely to give off tells in facial expressions and things like that if you actually believe the lie. So it's possible. Trump is the classic case of the dark triad: psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism.
Narcissistic personality.
And, it's possible he just believes it because... he's been bullshitting his whole life about everything. I mean, he's just, nothing is...
Yeah. My guess is that he's not actually lying, that he really
believes it, yeah.
The people around him know better, and they're the evil ones.
Yeah.
But Trump himself, being an engineer, not a psychologist, but my guess is that he can't allow himself to believe that he lost.
Right.
And
I'd
so
say
he will
that's-
go through whatever intellectual, jumping around is necessary, which will look weirder and weirder to those of us on the outside. And then there are people who discover they can make money off it, they can get elected off of it, they're the bad ones. But he himself,
yes,
I
exactly.
think, may.
Right.
Let's have a question from in here while I've got the mic. I saw this first, so.
I love the thing you said about human nature is really very biased towards finding patterns, because as soon as you can find patterns, you can predict what might happen next. And when you think about the opposite of that, it's really pretty terrifying, the idea of randomness. And so the idea that we all come up with theories to make our world a little bit safer makes a great deal of sense. And I guess what I'm kind of arguing is that firstly, that we all do this. And so for us to react with sneers towards other people's so-called conspiracy theories is one of the things that I think really makes part of this divide so serious, because people hate being patronized and held in contempt. And then I guess the next piece of how do we tilt things so that randomness becomes beautiful, surprising and fascinating, because that's really what natural selection is, right? And so I'm a science teacher, and that's my job, is to try to do that. And kids are much more amenable to it than adults are. And I wonder what you have to say about how do we cross that from it being threatening to being fascinating and beautiful.
Well, by what you just said, by just saying what you said, that was beautifully said. I bet your students don't fall for that as much. So educational reform, more of that, right? I mean, I've often thought I teach this class at Chapman University. So these are first-year college students. Skepticism 101, how to think like a scientist, right? Just basic stuff like we've been talking about tonight. Bayesian reasoning, signal detection theory, the kind of rationality community stuff, but it's not rocket science. I mean, anybody could understand this. Middle school, it should be taught in middle school. So, I mean, instead of taking, I don't know, maybe, what did I have? Geometry, pre-algebra, algebra, pre-calculus, calculus. What do I need all that stuff for? I've never used it because I didn't go into a STEM field. So maybe just take out one of those courses and add a how to think, just basically how to reason. Look, and here's the top 10 biases of motivated reasoning: the confirmation bias, the hindsight bias, the my side bias. Boom, 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 with examples. And there are people that do this. There are programs and books and stuff, but it's usually in college. I think earlier the better.
One thing that we did do was to teach kids how to do this kind
of
tricking you, how to make clickbait, for example.
Right.
Because apparently that inoculates them a little bit against that.
I also I like the examples we use from Skeptic Magazine, the paranormal, supernatural, astrology, UFOs, Bigfoot. These are fun topics that I find students like to talk about, right? Rather than some kind of philosophical logic course, if P then Q, if not P then not Q, and your eyes are just kind of glazing over like, what?
Yeah, so. we in the September 29th talk by Sam Woolley, on the landing page for that, if you go to look at our past talks, we have a whole list of references. And one of them actually is about, civic and media education, Stanford University Civic Online Reasoning Curriculum at cor.stanford.edu. And there are a bunch of others, the Young Skeptics and News Literacy Project, et cetera. So that's back on some of these earlier talks. Let's have another one. I'm going to get you next and then go.
So what's the deal with political polling?
Oh, boy.
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. Do you mean, is it accurate?
Well, we know it's not accurate. But
Well, what do you mean it's
what
not
are the
accurate?
conspiracies here with these polls? All of a sudden the Republicans are going to win everything.
I don't know. That particular, if you're talking about the midterms, that's flip-flop back and forth. I don't know, a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, they were definitely going to win, then they weren't, and now they are, and then they're not. I don't know. I think the polls are as good as self-report data, which is not that great. You're just asking people, what are you thinking now?
Yeah. And what
about
do they
anything.
want to say? Right.
It's always a shortcoming of social science research, of polling, survey data.
Someone else.
And also people, back to the random
Russell,
statistics thing. Again, just basic reasoning stuff. Like, what does it mean when the meteorologist on the news says there's a 30% chance of rain tomorrow? And you ask people what it means. You get like, well, it's going to rain 30% of the time. Or it'll rain 30% of the city. No, that isn't what it means. These are computer models that if you ran it 100 times, it'd rain 30 of them, right? Or just use the Hillary had a 70% chance of winning, and she lost. So those pollsters, what do they know? No, if you ran that election 100 times, Hillary wins 70 of them, Trump wins 30 of them. That was one of the 30. That's it, right? But people don't really understand that, I think.
Another one.
Okay.
Awesome. Before I get into my question, my teacher wanted me to touch on this issue of polling.
Oh, no.
He says, quote, if you have been following 538 aggregated polls, a caution, it looks like GOP-friendly polling outlets have been flooding the zone with their polls to depress Dem turnout, particularly as it relates to close Senate races. So we will see if that is
Maybe.
true
Anyway.
in a week. Anyway,
Question.
yeah, so I have kind of a fun question. I'm sure you've gotten it a lot. Are there any particular conspiracy theories that have yet to be verified that you think have a semblance of truth?
Oh.
Well, a lot of the ones I mentioned already that turned out we discovered because of whistleblowers and leaks and so on, that, was like, our government was doing that, like surveilling the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, her cell phone. What? Okay, so there's enough of that I am mildly suspicious. I'm not a big anti-government guy, but, it's like we should be cautious about. There's something happens when you get into power to everybody, Democrats and Republicans, even, President Obama. So here's my theory. When you get elected president, they take you in the back room and they go, okay, here's what's actually going on. And it's like, well, but I said I was going to close Gitmo. Yeah, you can't close Gitmo because if you do that, then this happens. This. All right, but I said I would. Yeah, don't worry about that. No one lives up to it. Okay.
I hope you will indulge me because I had a bizarre experience yesterday evening and I didn't sleep well. I went to CVS Longs to make sure I had enough candy, and a woman we were parked parallel. She had her window down, and she had a beautiful car. I said, "What is it?" She said, "It's a Jaguar convertible, 2001."
Okay.
And it was gorgeous.
Question.
I need a comment on this. Anyway, but she said, people are jealous of me, and every time I park it, they hit it. There was nothing. No, it was perfect. Okay, anyway, she said, Nancy Pelosi has taken $700,000 of Social Security money and has driven illegal migrants to the DMV and also registered them to vote. And then she said, Obama, he's from Indonesia. His father is the king of Indonesia.
Right. Oh boy.
And his real name is Barry.
Yes.
And I said, "Where are you getting your information?"
Yeah.
And I expected Fox News and no. She said, "I'm a journalist." And then she said she went. The real Barack Obama is in Kenya, and we flew there to interview him, and we waited, and he didn't show up, and we was told he's dead.
Uh-huh.
And then.
Wow.
Well, there's more, but I'll just close on this.
Yeah.
She said, about Michelle Obama? I said, I'm only, she's a man.
She's a man. Of course.
She said,
well, everybody knows that.
Have you seen the muscles in her arms?
Yeah.
And, she has a male,
right
she doesn't have children. Those are they just got them to look like a family.
Crisis actors.
And then she said, I have to go back into Okay, I'm going to finish, but I have a comment. She had come out of CVS, and then she says, 20 minutes are up. She said, I chased everybody out, and they're all Asian. I'm white, and they're Asian. And I told them, don't get it, you're going to die from it.
Oh, boy.
And then she said, my 20 minutes are up. I have to go in and get my second booster shot on the other arm.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. Yeah. Some people are
The thing is,
off.
I'm a professor, and I'm very well educated by Beta Kappa, Summa Cum Laude, etc. This woman's vote counts the same as mine. That's what troubled me all night.
That's
what
right.
do you say?
Right. Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. That's there are people like that. I meet them all the time as part of my day job. They write me
was it?
long letters. All right.
Thank you for the discussion. It's a great question. So I'm curious. So a lot of what was said is that it might be evolutionary or like biological in nature. And what I was wondering is if, to what extent you might think it might be a function of our values. So, for example, a lot of times when I'm trying to, talk to somebody and maybe try to get them to change their perspective, it's almost like I'm attacking them personally, and that this model forms part of their identity. And it made me wonder. I studied philosophy too, and engineer, but it made me wonder if maybe it's like something to do with like we're taught to be right, like and we're celebrated when we're right, but perhaps maybe if it was let's figure it out, or the goal isn't to be right, it's to figure it out. Or anyway, to what extent might it be a function of the values, and that's a construct of how people think, as opposed to it's biologically ingrained and we're almost programmed to be this way?
Well, we know that you can change norms just from the bottom up by everybody changing their language or how they respond to other people. I mean, people don't use the N-word anymore. How did that happen? There was no law passed. We all just decided, you know what, this is just really offensive. We're just not going to do this anymore, right? Or telling, gay jokes or jokes about women and or wife jokes. These used to be pretty popular. Now it's not cool. And so if enough of us kind of speak out or refuse to laugh at somebody's idiotic joke that's offensive, then the norms do shift slowly. Just thinking about this, I had a podcast guest today. We were talking about, what's the fastest civil rights revolution? It was the same-sex marriage thing happened pretty fast. From 2011, when it was about 50-50 in polls of whether it was acceptable or not. And then by 2015, the Supreme Court, voted to make it the law of the land. Same-sex marriage is now legal. And then pretty quickly, everyone just quit talking about it. And it just became just commonplace, right? And same thing with interracial marriages. There weren't many. It was illegal until 1967. And even in as late as like the 1990s, there was only like 1% of interracial marriages, mostly black men, white women. But now it's much higher. It's, I don't know, like 10 times higher than whatever. And somehow that kind of just slowly changes. Slow enough you don't really notice it. And then all of a sudden, like, here we are. Wow, things are much better. And I think if those of us in the kind of skeptical, rationality community, we just talk about like it's okay to change your mind. Really, it's not only is it okay, it's a virtue.
Yeah, it's a scientific way. Given more evidence, I'll change my mind.
That's right, and get away from the black and white. It's true or false. Just think about it in a more Bayesian way. It's likely true, it's likely false, maybe it could be 50-50. Like these UAPs, is it really aliens or not? Well, okay. It's the U means unidentified. That's all we know. I don't know what it is. Let's just wait. You don't have to say anything. We don't have to decide. Just wait and make that a virtue.
Oh, we got another question?
Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you think there's a danger in sort of satirical conspiracy theories, like the birds aren't real stuff.
Birds are.
I like that, actually. I found that very amusing. If you're not familiar with this young man, I forget his name. Do you remember his name? The birds are not real? Yeah. Anyway, so he started this thing that all birds that you see are actually drones. And people were taking him pretty seriously. He was driving around with a van and, birds are not real. And he had a bullhorn. He was like Alex Jones on the road. And, then he finally festive. 60 Minutes actually did a piece on this. It was great. I think it's all right because it shows the absurdity of really far out conspiracy theories. Then let me make a comment about Alex Jones in that verdict against him, the judgment against him. I'm kind of conflicted about this. It's like, free speech, but you can't harm people. And his words pretty much directly led to people going to these homes and harassing these people. But I can't help but wonder, I only know of a woman who's arrested and jailed for harassing somebody at their home. But why aren't all the other people that we hear about that took Alex Jones's stories and then went to these homes, why aren't they also culpable in that. So or Trump's speech on January 6th that morning, is he responsible? It's an interesting problem. I'm told by most First Amendment attorneys that it's a high bar to reach to go from a speech to violence by somebody else. And that they probably can't get him for being responsible for January 6th. We'll see, but anyway.
Okay, well, we have time for maybe one more question. Let's see what here.
So most of the conspiracy theories we've talked about are from the conservative side of the political spectrum, like QAnon and the Big Lie. What are the most common false narratives or beliefs you see among liberals?
Yeah, so as a predictor of conspiracy beliefs, Republicans and Democrats are approximately equal, but the specific kind of conspiracy that you're interested in, or race. Black Americans are more likely to think that the CIA planted crack cocaine or invented AIDS to decimate black populations. White Americans are more likely to think the government's taking away our guns. They're plotting to put gun owners in FEMA camps in Texas and so on. So the Obama birther one was endorsed more by Republicans. The 9/11 truther one is endorsed by more liberals. So, those kind of demographic features are more proxies for specific conspiracy theories rather than just general conspiracism or kind of paranoia or whatever. Anyway, yeah. And there's plenty on the left. I mean, most elections, the losing side, so this is the little tagline is conspiracies are for losers, that whoever loses the election thinks the other side did something. And Democrats do this every election. They always, just like the Republicans do. What's different now is that usually they drop it a couple of weeks after the election and go, okay, let's just focus on the next one. And so that's what's different now because they're still keeping it alive. Trump still thinks the 2016 election was rigged. It's like, dude, you won. You're supposed to, according to the social science research, you're supposed to shut up now.
Okay, I've got maybe one more. I just saw this.
So you had mentioned that the rise of social media and technology has increased the replicatability of many of these beliefs, and therefore we're seeing a rise in conspiracy theories. I wonder what solutions you either recommend that we take on a societal level or ones that you've seen that actually exist to counteract those additional.
I'm conflicted about this. These are private companies. I'm disinclined for the government to go in and regulate them and break them up and that sort of thing. And in general, I think it's just counter bad speech with better speech is kind of the general principle, with obvious exceptions of, libel slandering somebody that harms them physically or financially or whatever. You can't post the nuclear codes on Twitter, things like that. Those are low-hanging fruit. But in general, I think it's just better to counter it. And just social media is still fairly new, right? 2007 really is when it kind of launched. So that's not that long ago. It could be in 10 years, no one will be using Twitter. It'll be something else. Just like, MySpace. What happened to MySpace? Well, now Facebook is like an old thing for people like me to use. The kids these days, they don't use Facebook. They use whatever, Instagram, TikTok. In 10 years, it may be something we can't even think of, and none of these will be all that influential. So before we panic and think, well, this is an existential crisis, there's some evidence that, a lot of evidence that there's been a spike in teenage depression, anxiety, cutting, suicidal ideation, about twice as much in girls than boys. Why is that? Is it social media in general? Is it screen time in general? Is it social media in particular? Is it that site, Facebook, fear of missing out, fear of being left out? Anyway, the research is not clear yet on that. We don't know.
There are some things that are being suggested in the talk on September 29th. We talked about some of them. But for example, you could add what's called friction to things like Twitter, et cetera, that you can't just forward something immediately. You have to show that you've read it first. You're only allowed to forward it 5 times. You're only increase the friction of things being blasted out to everybody.
Interesting.
There are theories about how, does it really help to add something at the bottom saying this has been debunked? Does that help? Does it make it worse? one of the things that's happening is that a lot of corporations are now encrypting everything. Oh, we're going to do it for your privacy. Well, they're really doing it to some degree, so they can't monitor it. If it's encrypted, they can't be held responsible for the content. And yet we can tell, there's been some research in Twitter, that we can guess at whether something's true or false by watching the pattern. If it starts simultaneously at the top from like 10 locations and blasts downwards, with each of those people have lots of connections, maybe false. If it comes up from the bottom, from people who don't have a lot of connections, and it slowly grows outwards, maybe true, even if you can't see the actual content. So a lot of people are working on it, but I don't think they've got an answer, and that's something that we have to do. Of course, there's legislation. How do you hold someone responsible for this? And that's a whole legal tangle. There have been a lot of discussions about that.
Yeah.
Well,
good point.
We should wrap this up. So our gratitude to Dr. Michael Shermer for being with us today. And we are also...
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
And we are also grateful to our audience here, as well as to those listening to the recording. And now, this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, commemorating its 119th year of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.
Wow.